much. It's really great to see all these familiar names coming across the screen. I'm looking forward to this event and this discussion. So I'm really honored and delighted to introduce to all of you Kerry Sinanan, Assistant Professor of 18th Century Transatlantic Literature at the University of Texas, San Antonio. Before her move to Texas in 2018, Kerry was lecturer and Moore Institute Research Fellow at the National University of Ireland, Galway, after holding lectureships at the University of West England, Bristol, and Oxford Brookes University. Broadly considered, Kerry's research explores British literary engagements with and erasures of slavery, the slave trade, and colonialism in the 18th century Atlantic world. Her work to date has included articles on texts and authors including Mary Prince, Olaudah Equiano, Hannah More, Jane Austen, and the anonymously authored and until recently overlooked novel, The Woman of Color. The next 2 years are going to be big ones for Kerry, as she has forthcoming or under review several major projects that promise to move our field forward in its consideration of a multiracial colonizing past. These projects include a monograph, Myths of Mastery, Traders, Planters, and Colonial Agents, 1750 to 1834, currently under review, and an essay collection, Austen After 200, co-edited with Annika Bouts and Daniel Cook, all and due out this fall from Palgrave. So congratulations for that. She also is at work on what looks to be an important, very interesting new project, Beauty and the Breast, Representations of Women, Motherhood, and Breastfeeding from British Slavery to the Present. I could go on for a while about awards she's received and her work, but I'm just going to, in the interest of time, hand things over and say that her talk today is titled Clarissa and White Supremacy, Race, Gender, and Erasure.
Hello, can everybody see me? Thank you so much, Laura. And can I just ask if people can see the presentation? Oh, fantastic. Okay, then I'll try and say next slide when it's time. So thank you so much for giving up your time. I don't think I fully realized, I'm still not used to the US pattern yet. And especially to my US colleagues, this is a very hectic time of the semester. So thank you so much for being here. And I would like to thank the Beinecke Library, the James Ford Bell Library, the Yale Centre for British Art, and as Laura mentioned, the Moore Institute at NUI Galway for variously supporting the research. It comes out of the two book projects, really, the book project on Myths of Mastery on enslavers, and the second book project on Beauty and the Breast. And this really belongs to that second book project. And I also want to thank Rebecca Bullard so much, and Laura and Elaine McGurr for their work in setting up this event. I'm going to try and keep this to 35 minutes. I've tried hard to slash it well up into the wee hours of the morning, so please bear with me. Okay, let's all remember to say the white in white feminism out loud. And that's really my paper, and we can all stop. Okay, but that is really what my argument is. But my talk is also about how we think about what is fragmentary in literary form and how this works to construct gender and race. Even more broadly, this paper is about what and whom is given form and what and whom is denied form, and how we read both these presences and absences in the archives. Here I am clearly invoking Christina Sharp's In the Wake, which asks for new methodologies in order to undertake the wake work of keeping faith with the lost Black lives in the long history of transatlantic slave trade and racial capitalism. She describes the action of what is required to find new ways of both imagining and entering the different archives as, quote, a gathering, a collecting, and a reading towards a new analytic. Now, I want to be very clear here that I personally read Sharp's call to undertake work as primarily directed at Black scholars, and I am mindful of this. So I'm situating my work within a much broader tradition, from Jenny Sharp's Ghosts of Slavery, Jennifer Morgan's Labouring Woman, Marissa Fuentes' Dispossessed Lives, Saidiya Hartman, Lose Your Mother, Jessica Maria Johnson, Wicked Flesh, and I think collectively these people, these scholars are asking many of us to examine our disciplinary methodologies and to find new ways to narrate, remember, and bring out the willful obscurity of the colonial archive, the lives and experiences of enslaved women. I really am coming to Clarissa via the Black Atlantic. So in her opening to her book, Dispossessed Lives, Marissa Fuentes describes how she must, quote, trace the distortions of enslaved women's lives inherent in the archive. How do we narrate, she asks, fleeting glimpses of enslaved subjects? So this insistence on fragmentariness, on incompleteness, on absence, and yet the urgency to narrate nevertheless underlies what I will try to do today. On the one hand, we have Clarissa and her voluminous letters, her excesses and her textual overproduction. In her essay, Black Transactions, Rebecca calls this a superabundance. And yet Clarissa, the novel, of course, is often discussed in terms of fragments, scrap, detritus. I'm very aware of this paradox at the centre of my argument. The novel, as soon as we consider its form, unravels splinters, falls apart from the illusion of wholeness that the textual material object itself suggests. Clarissa is famously over 1 million words, all gathered together, and yet it is clearly disjointed and incomplete in many ways. Very simply, I'm arguing, though, that the fragmentariness that constitutes both Clarissa as character and Clarissa as novel, and the fragmentariness that characterize the archives of enslaved women and that formally constitute their experiences are not the same. Thus, in her letter, you can go to the slide 2 now, please. In her letter to Anna Howe, written upon her final escape from Loveless, while speaking in snatches and narrating her fragmented self, Clarissa can nevertheless write and tell her story to her friend and know that she will be believed and understood. Once more have I escaped, but alas, I, my best self, have not escaped. No more of me, my lost self. My intellects are touched. As Rebecca Barr argues so trenchantly in Clarissa, these kinds of textual fragments, like the novel itself, become objects whose worth, quote, is an index to and product of the individual. I think this is really insightful. This is how such fragmentariness works for Clarissa. I would argue further that her individualism and her subjectivity and her narrative all do cohere in the end to produce an intact woman in every sense of the word that Samuel Richardson wants us to consider important. Clarissa certainly offers a moral corrective to rapacious masculinity, exemplified perhaps by Captain Inkle of Richard Steele's Spectator story. But, and this is my point, she would totally be in the service of a reformed manliness, chaste and monogamous in its imperial endeavours. Indeed, she becomes, slide number 3 please, as Lovelace tells us, a metonymy for all women. When he predicts that her virtue shall stand in for all women, the novel, oh sorry, down one, yeah. The novel's act of narrative justness is in favour of wronged women in general. As Julie Park argues in her article, I Shall Enter Her Heart, the novel is constructed from many binary oppositions, inside, outside, absence, presence, self, other, abstract, material, public, private. I'm arguing that overriding or coalescing these binaries is the construction of Clarissa as a settler colonial imperial subject, the virtuous white woman of empire whose forging is central to the power that destroyed and decimated millions of lives of enslaved women. Despite its oppositions and its proliferating pieces, Clarissa participates in the logic of colonial sameness in terms of whiteness, which is in fact constructed by binarism. Throughout the novel, white and black are put into various oppositions surrounding morality, intentions, sincerity, designs. Lovelace compares Claire's family to black angels and white angels. Anna considers that her investigations regarding Rosebud that make Lovelace out to be apparently innocent could be, quote, a plot to set on foot to wash a blackamoor white, Lovelace being the blackened figure in terms of race as well as in terms of purpose. Clarissa herself cannot account for Lovelace's chameleon-like character, quote, and though black seems to be his natural colour, yet he has taken great pains to make me think him nothing but white. So while Julie Park focuses on binaries more generally as central to the novel's production of fetish, I want to think of binaries in Clarissa as constitutive of racialized colonial discourse. To go back to an oldie but a goodie, Homi Bhabha reminds us that these very binaries in colonial discourse, quote, aspire to the horizon of holism. Quote, the colonial signifier, neither one nor the other, is an act of ambivalent signification, literally splitting the difference between the binary oppositions or polarities through which we think cultural difference. This endless vacillation that characterises not just Lovelace, but also Clarissa, her famous ambivalence. And we may remember that in Designing Women, Tita Chico reads this ambivalence as part of Richardson's satiric purpose. This ambivalence makes a lot of sense if we read Clarissa not just as a product of, but also as a tool of colonial discourse. Indeed, as Park states, in Clarissa we see a woman who becomes an icon for virtuous femininity, despite and indeed through her disturbing need to validate her virtue by dying. Lovelace emphasises this when he realises that on his last occasion of seeing Clarissa, quote, "Her innocence was so triumphant over my premeditated guilt." Clarissa is more possessing of integrity in the plot after her violation. And we can go to slide number, next slide, please. In these paintings of Dido and Lucretia, both founding figures for Clarissa and Pamela, we see this transcendence, the phantasmagoric qualities ascribed to their almost disembodied femininity, emphatically asserted by their whiteness. And of course, famously said that Dido here was an example of supreme beauty, disturbingly. This angel, this icon of virtue, we have long known is central to empire, and yet Clarissa is not really discussed, I think, in terms of her imperial function. In Torrid Zones, going back, Felicity Nussbaum showed us how the making of domestic womanhood was central to imagining a sexualized woman of empire, and she focused there on Pamela, volumes 1 and 2. Pamela herself, Nussbaum argued, becomes the virtuous case for monogamy at home, and the counterpoint of that is the polygamous women of empire who are overly sexualized. Clarissa, of course, does not want to be married at all. She and Anna want to be able to live together outside the business of marriages, but still as representatives of virtuous womanhood. And part of that alternative plot of the novel, I think, is Richardson showing that rational, moral women could be property inheritors and could share in the project of Britain alongside male primogeniture if allowed. But this alternative social strand doesn't disrupt patriarchal empire. Possibly it stabilizes and corrects it from its own worst excesses. I'm extending the dynamic that Nussbaum and also Nancy Armstrong detailed to the kind of purity and virtue that Clarissa embodies outside of marriage. I think you can go on to the next slide. An emphatic assertion of the white female resistance to rape and an assertion of a model of female virginity at the heart of empire. Many critics have written about the progression of virtue from Pamela to Clarissa, culminating in Sir Charles Grandison, where moral ambivalence is expunged. And recently here on this seminar, Rebecca Barr also noticed that Sir Charles Grandison's chastity was a prefiguring of the chastisement of empire that we see in St. John Rivers and Jane Eyre. In her book, Freedom's Empire, Laura Doyle argues that prior to her trauma, quote, Clarissa embodies the Atlantic Anglo-Protestant idea in her will to transparency. And Doyle reads Clarissa's trials as a critique of the forces she exists within that prevent her full embodiment of Protestant liberty. I read Clarissa's violation instead as necessary to that expression of freedom, which has settler colonial dimensions. As Doyle explained, Clarissa inherits her landed wealth from her grandfather that goes back time immemorial, quote, but her brother John inherits, quote, the new colonial wealth from Doyle. Doyle's reading of Clarissa and other novels in the context of Anglicanism forged in the Atlantic offers a necessary global context to the heroine's story. But Doyle reads the fragmentation of Clarissa's selfhood in textual production after she has been raped as resonating, quote, and this is from Doyle, resonating exactly with the ruinous unanchoring experience of enslaved people crossing the Middle Passage, here subsumed within the story of a pure Anglo-Atlantic martyr. And Doyle draws our attention to the sea metaphors in this paper fragment, saying that they resonate with the experiences of the Middle Passage. Clarissa describes being pursued by waves and having to row the galley. Now, while Doyle reads this intersection as, quote, an Atlantic pattern of shared imagery, that reveals a crisis between black and white subjects of the Atlantic in modernity, I want to argue that this is actually not sharing at all, but textual appropriation and representation in form within an epistolary novel. And this is a strategy that produces Clarissa as the necessary white female victim who strategically obscures the real victims en masse of colonial apocalypse. While Doyle sees the puzzle to transparency as under pressure and in crisis from the ravages of modernity, I read it as a formally strategic production of what Gerald Horne names, quote, a pan-European initiative, the devastating Whiteness project, quote, the elongated process whereby religion was supplanted by race as the animating axis of society which reached its zenith in the Americas. This whiteness is not sharing anything at all, but will appropriate, possess, and command. And this is something that Toni Morrison shows us very well in A Mercy in her novel, when she delineates the white Protestant woman Rebecca crossing the mid-Atlantic, and she compares that experience narratively with Florence's mother's crossing, and Florence's mother is an enslaved woman. They're not the same experience. No, Clarissa's fragments are not the fragments that Norbese Philip must rearrange for her rendition of Zong. These are fragments that Norbese Phillips must gather and rearrange from the colonial archive precisely because the victims of Zong could not put their experiences into form. As Nicole Aljo recently reminds us in her article Reading the Memoirs of the Life of Florence Hall, in order to find ways to understand what enslaved people might have experienced and lived, quote, we have to read the mediated stories of enslavement that exist as fragments or textual splinters in the archive. This phrase, textual splinters, is quoted from John Sensbach and describes the literary textual form that stories and histories of enslaved women's lives take. And I emphasize that what has not been put into form from the enslaved, what remains fragmentary, shattered scarred fragments, as opposed to the collated entire form of the novel, which, however internally fragmented it is nevertheless physically coherent, and its kind of fragmentariness is not to be compared with the scattered, mediated slivers of enslaved women's lives. I'm basically arguing that Clarissa is produced by settler, colonial, imperial British culture that requires her violation and requires her Lucretian morality and femininity as a tool of white supremacy. You can go to the next slide now. So I'm going to turn to look at some archival evidence in a moment. The shards of experience, I even hesitate to use that word, of enslaved black women may be read in Thomas Thistlewood's diaries. Hartman's famous words here from her essay Venus in Two Acts capture both the difficulty of looking for enslaved women in the archives and also the fact that sexual violation characterizes their experience. The stories that exist are not about them. The archive is a death sentence, a display of the violated body, an inventory. And she uses the name Venus to capture, you can go to the next slide, please, to capture the sexuality of the enslaved woman as she was brought across the middle, which quite grotesquely depicted here in Thomas Stothard's engraving for Brian Edwards. You can go to the next slide. Hartman captures the already captured sexuality of the enslaved woman as she was brought across the Middle Passage for consumption, for her labour, for her belly, her absorption into a consuming system that is really defined legally in the 1662 Virginia law, partus sequitur ventrum, that which is brought forth follows the belly, and that established the legal status of enslaved children derived from their mother and simultaneously legalized the mass rape of enslaved women by their owners. So I'm going to turn to look at Thomas Thistlewood's diary to think about different kinds of fragmentariness and different types of textual archives. Thomas Thistlewood arrived in Jamaica from England in need of work and a career in 1748, and he left behind a considerable archive of over 10,000 pages. As Douglas Hall and Trevor Bernard, who have both written extensively about Thistlewood, note, among the depravities he lists, he details his everyday rape of enslaved women. I'm going to use this word, although the male historians hesitate to use it, because there cannot be consent in slavery. But I'm also going to qualify what I've just said by Sharon Block and Fuentes, help us with this idea of discussing consent or absence of consent. But I also note, along with both Sharon Block and Marissa Fuentes, that it's very hard to name the range of sexual encounters that enslaved women had, given the dynamics of slavery. As Fuentes writes, quote, even as we search for in-between categories inhabiting space between rape and consent, we are in effect reinscribing the very terms that fundamentally fail to account for the sexual experiences of enslaved women. Okay, so I got to spend a month in the Thistlewood archive, and I only scratched the surface. So I'll just show you a tiny snippet of what I saw there. Diary 3 begins on the Egypt plantation where Thistlewood was overseer in 1752, and he notes purchasing some newly some enslaved women. You can go to the next slide. So I've just collated some of the extracts, and even actually representing in this way extracts from the diaries is really difficult. How do we capture those diary fragments in a printed form? It's very challenging. Entry number 39 is Abba. Number 42 is Betty. Number 43 is Marina. And Thistlewood notes the colour of their skin, how dark or light they are, and also their size. Abba seems to be a young child, and she seems to have recently crossed the Middle Passage, but even deducing this much takes a bit of guesswork and assuming. So when I started with the 1752 diary, I wanted to trace Abba through these if I could, and I only managed to do a tiny bit of this work in the month that I had. Reading her fragments and shards is much harder than reading through Clarissa's 1 million words. Going through 10,000 pages of Thistlewood's diary, looking closely for the name or for her erasure when she might be in a sentence without being named, I have to be sure not to miss her in Thistlewood's difficult script. I got as far as 1762 when she's had a baby. Douglas Hall has done a little bit of, he's got one small paragraph on Abba, and he guesses that it was not Thistlewood's, but also when you see this final one, my Abba here today gave her 2 bird's eye handkerchiefs. How do we read that my? How do we read that sort of exchange? And I've just, I know it's disturbing to read, but I've also chosen some of the extracts that show how violent Thistlewood was on a regular basis. And in fact, all this is what was happening on slave plantations. So Mountain Lucy is regularly beaten and gagged on just a very regular basis. And you also see Fibba's name, 1762, at night come Fibba, and come is the Latin word that Thistlewood uses to describe sexual encounters of all kinds. And sometimes he says how good or bad they were. So, even in these small extracts, we get a sense of the range. But how do we read it? What does it tell us? Do these extracts tell us very much at all? And I think this is why I do turn to Black Atlantic novels like A Mercy and Marlon James's The Book of Night Women, who he's clearly read the Thistlewood Diaries, for a sense of critical fabulation, as Saidiya Hartman, another way of entering the archive, another way of collating the archive. Okay, in Clarissa, Lovelace is forced to record her outright absolute rejection of. You can go on to the next slide if you like. And I'll come to this in a moment. And in his last meeting with Clarissa, he records her direct words, quote, "I have my senses, Lovelace, and from my heart I despise thee, thou very poor Lovelace." Clarissa's words forge her virtue. We can never know what Abba thought or felt about Thistlewood. In The Book of Night Woman, Marlon James engages in a powerful active narrative and critical fabulation, a method through which we might critically imagine the lives of enslaved women. And this is a quotation where he describes Lilith, an enslaved girl, being brought from one plantation to another. Quote, "They set out from late morning, and now the hot sun threatening midday. That be what Lilith thinking when she gives herself allowance to think. Most time her thinking be like talking, which be nothing at all." In a novel in which Lilith is ferociously and repeatedly whipped and raped for what she has been thinking and maybe about to do, Marlon James makes us on the danger of having thoughts. Not only do these fragments from Thistlewood's diaries only lead us so far, but even what might have been represented in the first place is already policed, disciplined, and curtailed. Lilith is constantly battling with herself not to think. That's her big battle, is not to think, not to have any thoughts. Okay, now as Terry Eagleton quite some time ago argued, for Clarissa, it is, quote, "the ideology of representation which characterises Clarissa herself. I always speak and write the sincere dictates of my heart." And she pursues what Eagleton terms, quote, "the transparent communication of morally useful meaning." So this Puritan transparency of intention, I think, creates a holistic, virtuous self and cannot, I want to now move on to argue, be divorced from the nearly transparent quality of Clarissa's body, which also mediates herself and her thoughts. So let's think about Clarissa's whiteness and what that means. In William, this is just an extract from the John Stedman archive, which I also got to see, and this is the manuscript for his printed narrative, and you can go on to the next slide. In William Blake's engraving after John Stedman for Stedman's published narrative of a 5 years expedition against the revolted Negroes of Suriname, we see depicted Europe supported by Africa and America. This is the last of 80 plates that Joseph Johnson commissioned for the lengthy history travelogue narrative that Stedman put together based on his notes and diaries while stationed in Suriname as a paid mercenary for the Dutch to quash the Maroon rebels. Stedman frames this image with what sounds like a present-day colourblind appeal to shared humanity. Feeling reader, I will close the scene with a picture of Europe supported by Africa and America. And he says, let us all support each other. We all differ only in the colour. And then he carries on saying that those with superiority must dispose of our lowest dependence with cheerfulness. It's very clear that as soon as Stedman attempts to abolish a biologically essentialist race hierarchy based on skin colour, we're all human, he immediately reinstates it through a structured racism that, after all, assigns women to hierarchised positions based on their skin colour. So this is racialised gender laid out for us. In a way, this print does the work of what I'm trying to argue here for me. The black and brown women have slave bonds around their arm, clearly propping up Europe, and are entwined by a rope vine that the white woman holds. She is central and they are to her side. The echoes of Botticelli's Venus are clear, but only the white woman is allowed the modesty of her hair covering her body. At the same time, all women are made for consuming and appropriating white male gaze. Their gender renders them vulnerable, but the hierarchy under male imperialism is clear too. The woman of colour make direct contact with the male viewer, while the white figure looks modestly down with a blush on her cheeks, so often constructed as a sign of female virtue, and certainly it is so in Clarissa. The image lays bare the entanglements of white femininity with racial capitalism, and Stedman's accompanying words make it clear that this is an allegory for global empire. The white woman is the vessel of male primogeniture, which will transfer the profits and property generated by the labour of her sisters into the global white ownership. So in this context, I'm arguing, Richardson forges an emphatically virtuous Clarissa who remains pure despite her violation. Now, I want to just draw attention to a potential for Clarissa criticism that might fall into the trap of replicating some of these dynamics by insisting on Clarissa's virtue and her resistance and her victimization as a female predicament. So in her wonderful book, Born Yesterday, Stephanie Inslee Hirschnow joins with others to read the narrative form of Clarissa as moving away from a realism rooted in empirically gleaned fact towards, quote, an aspirational truth that might be better than, quote, the real world. And we're told in the book, her moral authority, quote, is forged in isolation from experience. And this is such a vital insight into narrative form and gender. But what I'm pointing out here is that such feminist insistences on Clarissa's morality is, quote, based on ignorance and innocence, also need to name explicitly that this is the white woman who's being produced as innocent and untouched and therefore moral, and that the hidden and unacknowledged binary opposite of this is the not innocent, experienced enslaved woman of empire who may have no such experience from lived reality. And I just want to draw our attention to this book, which it's been out a long time, but I only recently came across it. Oya Ronke Oya Wumi names the gendering of hierarchy in Western discourse as sisterarchy. What a great word. In her book, The Invention of Woman. And she argued why African and specifically Yoruba studies must decolonize themselves of imported Western gender theory, that despite its insistence on gender as construction rather than biological fact, nevertheless returns cross-cultural gender studies to a universal gender category. Often, she says, the categorization of women in feminist discourse as homogeneous, bioanatomically determined group, which is also constituted as powerless and victimized, doesn't reflect the fact that gender relations are social, historically grounded, and different in different cultures. So I think in Blake's print, we're seeing here those dynamics of that exportation of the category of woman to those being appropriated by Western culture. And so we really need to disrupt that. So when we discuss Richardson's feminist commitments and Clarissa, I think it's really vital to ensure we're not exporting, as Stedman does, a specifically white imperial womanhood as a universal. And in her essay, Kathleen Lubey extends readings of Richardson's examinations of sexualized commerce in the novel to show us how he minutely details the systematic instrumentalization of women's bodies to support socio-political institutions that both disenfranchise them and delimit their ontological possibilities, end quote. This is such a helpful way of understanding the atomization of process that Richardson engages in. But at the same time, it is a white womanhood that's being constructed out of these violations and victimizations. And she then becomes a handmaid of empire. So that's really my argument. And I think the role of that violated woman is still one of racialized domination over colonized and enslaved women of empire who have no such access either to minute descriptions of their depredations, nor to the concomitant assertions of their moral superiority. We can go on to the next slide. To offer a counterpoint, in her history, Mary Prince's negotiations of the demands on her virtue by her abolitionist audience, so I'm talking about the history of Mary Prince here, 1831. And it's really impossible for her to detail explicitly what has happened to her body in slavery. And we are asked again to read between the gaps and silences. And she was attacked at the time in various pamphlets and letters that responded to her narrative, to her petition. And there was a court case against her enslavers in Britain, the Woods. So then the Woods, her owners in Britain who refused to free her, brought a libel case against Thomas Pringle and the Anti-Slavery Society for publishing Mary Prince's history and trying to make her out to be a liar. So in the court transcription of the Woods libel case against Thomas Pringle, we actually see that Prince leverages her position as a mistress to a white man, Captain Abbott, to expose the gendered hypocrisies of the Caribbean. And this is from the record. One night she found another woman in bed with the captain in her house. This woman had pretended to be a friend of the witness laughter. Witness licked her and she was obliged to get out of bed a laugh. The captain laughed. The woman said she did it to plague the witness. Witness, Mary Prince, took her the next day to the Moravian Black leader when she denied it, and the witness licked her again. The woman then complained before a magistrate, Mr. Justice Diet, and when the story was told, they all laughed. So I just am fascinated by this extract, this fragment. The extract clearly presents a less than demure Prince, who, far from trying to disguise the fact of her affair with Captain Abbott, seems to play to an audience representing her right to object to Abbott's infidelity and her right to punish her rival. And so what I'm really saying here is that what are the consequences for moral authority? She's clearly experienced. She's not hiding from the real world. This is not innocence, and it's not ignorance. Okay. So this glimpse of Prince shows that she did actually gain some moral authority from her sexual experience. From Clarissa to Pamela, from Pamela to Clarissa, we see a move from female chastity to virtue, regardless of rape, in fact, because of it. The constructs of virtuous white woman of empire. And I want to draw attention to the fact that it's Clarissa's Puritan attributes that are asserted at the end of the novel. You can go on to the next slide if you can. And she details all these attributes. She was an excellent economist and housewife. And she quotes Clarissa's many gendered maxims. Let our sex, she quotes Clarissa saying, therefore seek to make themselves mistresses of all that is excellent and not incongruous to their own sex. And I just think, we have to wrestle also with Clarissa's conservatism. So I'm situating Clarissa as a white woman of empire in a much broader historical context, so well outlined by Gerald Horne in his book, The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, in which he charts the making of whiteness out of Puritanism, out of the religious strife of 16th and 17th century Europe. For settler colonialism, quote, the stakes were so large, swathes of land taken illicitly from indigenous to then be stocked by enslaved Africans, the ideology so suffused with lingering religious and accelerating religious bigotry, that the victimized would ineluctably be numerous. Assuredly, whiteness or race was a more sturdy identity politics for implanting settler colonialism than religion, which often served to split the settlers. So, and it's a really good description. It's really good, a powerful analysis of how whiteness gets made out of all these different aspects. By 1747, the year of Clarissa's publication, Liverpool had overtaken Bristol as Britain's main slave trading port, making out of Liverpool alone about 50 voyages to capture around 25,000 Africans a year. The Harlows, like the Birchams in Mansfield Park, are new money. Her Uncle Anthony makes his money in sea trade and is inevitably bound up with slavery and empire at the time. And the Harlows' treatment of Clarissa is in part to do with their insatiable greed for more money, more power, more social standing, all of which embody British imperial desires at the time. Obsessed with her virtue, obedience, and her capacity to generate more wealth, Clarissa's family, as much as Lovelace, forge her as a fetishized object, an individual paradoxically made out of this play between virtue and defilement. At the end of the novel, she is for Lovelace, but also for her community, quote, a divine creature with a purity so angelic, and for Anna Howe with a sincerity, quote, that will not be found to be once impeachable. So this is what I'm saying. Clarissa emerges with her morality intact, in fact, emphasized. Now, can we go on to the next slide, please? I'll try and wrap up in a few minutes. Laura Doyle, Raymond Hilliard, and others have noted the imperial racialized binaries throughout Clarissa. We may remember that upon first encountering Clarissa, Lovelace writes to Belford in letter 31 and casts himself as Othello. Perdition catch my soul, but I do love her. Here, not only does Lovelace foreshadow that Clarissa is in mortal danger from her love, and he will be damned, but he entwines himself immediately in a racialized discourse about excessive love, jealousy, and revenge that is racialized, assigning all these qualities to a black man. Race is there in Clarissa from quite early on. And then Lovelace continues to quote from Abraham Cowley's poem Beauty in the Mistress from 1656. Beauty, thou wild fantastic ape, who dost in every country change thy shape, here black, there brown, here tawny, there white. And this is a painting from Agostino Brunias, where he, in many, many paintings, delineates the different ranges of beauty and the colours that go with them. So the comparison of beauty to an ape is certainly conceit that joins woman to the bestial. I mean, we can link it to the Stedman print, but Lovelace also has an imperial eye in this stanza. And it is this global range of woman within which the white woman is most desirable. So I'm arguing that part of Richardson's agenda is to remove Clarissa from this imputation of inconstancy and sexual availability and to assert her as a pure white woman. Natalie Zajac names this process part of settler colonial logic. White women were placed on a pedestal, black and mixed race women, both enslaved and free, had to assume all the varieties of sexual morality and to themselves be temptresses of white male virtue. Of course, part of Lovelace's stated purpose is to prove that Clarissa would indeed provide him with his own heirs should they be married. Carry on to the next slide. When describing her to Belford as he captured, Lovelace's emphasis of Clarissa's whiteness reaches superlative heights. And this is quite a famous passage. Her wax-like flesh, I never in my life beheld a skin so illustriously fair. It's like a lily, it's like snow. But this lady is all glowing, all charming flesh and blood. So clear is she that every meandering vein is to be seen in all the lovely parts of her which custom permits to be visible. So body, form, whiteness, and moral purity are all fused here, not just by Lovelace, but by the discourse throughout the novel. Clarissa is increasingly whitened as the plot progresses, and she becomes by Belford dressed in virgin white, even more transparently blue than her veins are transparent, and even the inside of her coffin is lined with white satin from which she will rise transparently white. And I'm going to try and wrap up soon so we have time to discuss, but I'll just remind us all that in The Woman of Colour, Augustus Merton speaks of his disgust at Olivia's brown skin because he is used to a transparent skin of ivory. I think I'm going to have to just cut here, but if you can just go down to the next slide, I'll make this the last one. This is going back to John Stedman's narrative. This is John Stedman's description of Joanna, who was his Suriname wife, an enslaved mixed race woman whom he could not free, and he describes her in this sort of range of Neoplatonic arsenal here. But he says her cheeks glowed in spite of her olive complexion. And if you just scroll down one more, I'll show you how actually, before Stedman writes that passage in his narrative, and before he does the drawing that becomes this print, Stedman records his first meetings with Joanna in his original diary, which I was also able to see. And if you just scroll up one more, I'll end with this section on the diary. So this is from John Stedman's Sinanan diary. And Joanna exists as fragments, and marginalia receive cordial and 2 fine oranges from a girl. So these details regarding Joanna are fragmentary in his diary, and he gathers her together into this sort of Petrarchan ideal, who is almost perfect but not quite, almost but not white, in Homi Bhabha's words. And so I'm just going to end with saying that the fragments that are written by Stedman make Joanna a captive in a way that Clarissa is not, because it is not out of Clarissa's belly, as Hortense Spillers and others describe it, that the labour and profits of empire will flow. Joanna does have a son with Stedman, but John Stedman is unable to purchase her. Her owners will not allow him to redeem her freedom. Her death and life become no symbol of womanhood, but another life lost in the white apocalypse. So I'm hoping that in showing how Clarissa relates to or can be read alongside these Black Atlantic works, I want to sort of dispel the segregation that I think is built up between her text and her life and those of Black and brown women of empire. But that segregation has been necessary to require to maintain a white supremacy, and it begins to collapse once we allow texts like the warps and wefts of the Black Atlantic itself to intertwine. Thank you for staying with me for that.
Kerry, thank you very, very much indeed for that amazing talk that took us through those extraordinary and deeply disturbing manuscripts and Clarissa and framing it all for us in such a thought-provoking and rich way. Many, many thanks. I know that many people here will want to offer their thanks, and to do that, what you need to do is to head down to the bottom right hand side of your screen, where you should be able to access the chat, and I think Elaine is going to make that re-available to us now. So if you would like to just offer a word of thanks to Kerry then as a kind of virtual form of applause, then please feel free to do that now. We'll also be using the chat for questions and answers in a moment. If you're having any difficulty at all finding the chat, then there's a hands up button at the bottom of the screen, and you can use that, and Elaine, who is our tech whiz today, will help you out with it. But it really was quite an extraordinary talk, and there will be lots of questions, I know. I wonder, while people are offering their thanks and gathering their thoughts, whether I could just kick things off by saying how struck I was by the language of fragmentation and gathering and collating and even whiteness and white space, and how that resonated for me with the material form of Clarissa as a not just a monumental text, but also obviously as a printed text, made by a printer. And I wondered whether you have any reflections on that, on the shift in medium, not just between the different kinds of fragments, but between print and manuscript, and of course orality in the case of Mary Prince's narrative, which is, you know, such an important part of that text, and whether we ought to think about print as a kind of colonial technology, as a space that enables a kind of whiteness.
No, absolutely, and you know, I've offered some thoughts here from my research, but I've really tried to show the sense in which I'm very much indebted to all the Clarissa and Richardson scholarship out there. You know, there's just so much rich stuff, and in fact, Laura Doyle in her book that I mentioned about empire does really emphasize that point, that she says Richardson, that paper 10 actually is about print, the triumph and power of print technology, and I think that is absolutely a key part of all of this. What gets gathered, I know, of course Richardson is a printer, what gets gathered into printed form, and what kind of durability and what kind of materiality and existence that has, as you say, as opposed to the fragments. I mean, even to some very small mundane things, the difficulty of representing the archival research and from the archives into slides or into a handout is fraught with moral questions. I've really just had to edit a whole lot just to pick out. So even what you're seeing isn't really a true representation of even those archives. But the printed text, no matter what the editing and whatever the choices have been made, has an authority of wholeness and has an authority of originality. And has an authority of direct relationship. Now, of course, that's disrupted as soon as we say that, because these are letters that have been gathered, and the letters were supposed to be manuscripts in the first place. So I think that's just I hope you can understand. I had to cut so much for this talk, and I'm sorry I still went on too long and longer than I had wanted to. But that was certainly a question that is worthy of further thought.
Great, thank you so much. And it may have felt as though to you as though you had to cut things and pull things out and not represent, but for us in the audience it felt wonderfully integrated, and it didn't come across something that had been pulled apart at all. So thank you so much. I'm going to look through the chat just to see whether there are any questions. It's always tricky when people are giving thanks and putting questions as well. Please don't hold back or feel that. And actually, particularly maybe if you're coming to this being very new. So if you're a graduate student or somebody who isn't involved in research seminars very much, please don't feel that you shouldn't ask a question. We would love to have questions as well if you're in that position. And I wonder, picking up on that same train of thought, if we think of print as a kind of colonial technology, how we then might think about manuscripts and what those diaries represent, because it seems that there was a huge capacity for slipperiness in the diaries, in the move into Latin to describe different kinds of sexual encounters, the use of one word, cum, to describe what you said were quite clearly a range of different kinds of sexual encounters. Whether actually does manuscript enable a kind of ethical slipperiness in itself? I don't know whether that's overreading. And it would be interesting to hear more about your experiences in those archives, because they sounded extraordinarily rich and valuable and awful at the same time.
Yeah, and somebody's written here, what does the XXX mean? And I mean, I don't know is the answer. One can begin to gather a possible understanding if you see this repeated over and over again, which it is. But we all know what our little symbols in our diaries might mean or might not mean, and how can that be laid, how that can be laid bare. It's very hard. There was one moment I had where I was sure that Thomas Thistlewood had drawn a heart beside Phoebe's name. It's a heart, but the manuscript person in the Beinecke Library was definitively, no, that's not a heart. It's just a random ink mark. So again, what it's so hard, and yeah, I think it's really important to bear in mind that we do, especially in 18th century studies, and I do too, place a lot of store at being able to access archives, but that doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, that's why I'm drawing attention to Marlon James's amazing novel, because I think a lot of the questions I want answered are in this novel and in Toni Morrison's A Mercy and in other novels, where he gives us a version of a reading of what seems possible and likely. So yeah, I mean, I think that sense of authority in manuscripts and slipperiness and ethics is so important. But I do think, on a hopeful note, that this is possibly what literary scholars, as I am one, have to bring to the table, because a lot of the people I'm citing here are historians, and I do think that things are much more slippery sometimes, certainly than maybe Trevor Bernard allows for, even in his monumentally important work on Thomas Thistlewood. There was a good question from Tricia Matthew that just flashed up and disappeared.
There was. So question from Tricia Matthew. And I'll read them out just because then we capture them on the recording as well. So I would be interested to know how Kerry draws a distinction between Clarissa as a fictional figure and Joanna presented in a memoir, constructed to be sure, but with the aim of representing an experience.
I think that's just the question, really. I mean, what I'm thinking about as I read a lot of Clarissa scholarship is the way in which this fictional character comes to stand in, actually, for something that's assumed to be real and actually has a very powerful effect in settler colonial dynamics, regardless of her fictionality. I mean, we all know the devastating history of the pure white woman. And you know, usually it's the accusation of rape against a black man or a brown man, and it goes all the way through to passage to India, it goes all the way through to the lynching history in the United States. So I think that boundary between real and fiction is really important. All of what settler colonialism draws on, as Horn draws our attention to, is a myth, and that's really what my first book's about, myths of mastery. And then with Joanna, I mean, you know, again, that question of, am I getting closer to a real Joanna? When I look at the diary entries in which Stedman first names her as bringing him oranges, he has a fever, and Joanna seems to be sent by her mother, or does she go willingly, or is this the beginning of an economy? Is Joanna deliberately saying, I'm here, I will be your Suriname wife, and I want something out of this? It's very, very hard to know. But is that Joanna in those diary fragments any more real than the fictionalized Joanna of the printed narrative? It's, you know, these are just all really important questions to keep at the forefront, and I'm not sure I have all the answers.
Great, thank you. Question from Lizzie. She says, this is probably naive, but is Princess licking literal now, or does it refer metaphorically to a beating?
Yeah, it's a West Indian word. So I having grown up in Trinidad, I'm quite familiar with that word, to lick somebody. And so that's another interesting moment in that archive, is that West Indian Caribbean word, lick, getting us closer to the actual speech of Mary Prince. Is her laughter also contained in the word laughter? It's very hard for me not to imagine her laughing, but we don't know. And am I projecting that on to Mary Prince? So that's a quick answer to that one.
Great, thank you. A question from Sal Nicolazzo. Thank you so much for this talk, such an important intervention. I was wondering whether you'd be able to speak a bit to how Clarissa's afterlives also foundationally construct the novel as a site for the articulation of white womanhood in the context of empire. Not only the use of Clarissa as a founding archetype for early American seduction novels, but also the ongoing critical tradition surrounding Richardson in 18th century studies.
Yeah, I mean, that's really, and I know that's where you Richardsonians can help me out, because I'm not as familiar with the actual afterlives of Clarissa. I have so much reading to do, and I think that's another thing I want to emphasize, is the amount of labor it takes to make it, you know, to look at both the canon and these, you know, fragmented archives. It's like you've got to do double time. So yeah, I mean, I think this is one thing I would just ask us to just renew our focus on, is that work that Clarissa as a fictional character, but as a symbolically important figure in settler colonialism, is doing. And I think it's carrying on today politically, but it's also carrying on very much, I think, in 18th century studies that and in 18th century feminist work. And I think that's why I find this book, The Invention of Woman, so helpful, because it just really calls out that this idea of woman is always white woman. It's being exported as part of global imperialism. So just all of us, I include myself, have to keep thinking of what we mean by these terms and what they include, as well as what they help us to represent.
Thanks. A question from Ellen Moody. This may be anachronistic and I'm not sure I should ask it, but Kerry made me think of how white, the colour white, has been associated with contemporary feminism. Hillary Clinton wore a white suit for her speech accepting her nomination. Recently, Kamala Harris did. Do you know when this association started? How should we regard it?
Well, that's really interesting. And I was thinking of pearls as well. I know there's a lot of symbolism. Oh, I mean, you know, yeah, I'll just say yes. I think we should pay attention to that, and I think we should look at how and where it's used. And of course, you know, this isn't a direct answer, but one thing that came out of the sort of pink pussy hat women's marches was that they were mostly tailored towards white women. And the Me Too movement started by Tarana Burke, quickly left behind the black lower class women that it was originally intended to uplift and support. So I think this repeated pattern is something we have to absolutely keep our eye upon.
A question from Dan Kerry. Can you comment on the "perdition catch my soul" quotation from Othello?
Yeah, I mean, yes, that was a section I cut. I mean, this is just fascinating, isn't it? You know, because I want to just remind us all that Equiano, Lardo Equiano, also uses, thank you, Stephanie, for that. It's a colour used by suffragettes, the white. So we might want to think about that too. Of course, you know, when white women get the vote, it's white women who get the vote in that history. But Equiano casts himself as Othello early in his narrative too, and he says, "I will tell a round and varnished tale." So I just think in reading Othello as a text that's drawn on by other Black Atlantic texts is really interesting. But actually, you know, this is what I had to cut a lot. When you start looking for the racialized comparisons and metaphors in Clarissa, they abound. And so the Othello one is most astounding. So perdition catch my soul. You know, first of all, we have to unpack how we read that in Othello itself. Othello's already associating his love, his desire for Desdemona as going to lead to his damnation. But the displacement is onto her rather than his own culpability of when he will murder her. And you know, this is always the dynamic that Lovelace, and especially in that quotation from the poem as well, it's always women's fault for tempting men. And so this is why they're so alluring, and that print of Stebbins, you know, they're so alluring, they're so tempting. How can we make sure they're pure? So I think he's drawing on Othello in this way, but he's also drawing on a sort of lasciviousness and appropriation that's raced. He's blackening himself in that moment too. So I think there's just so many things to unpack from that quotation.
A question from Charlotte Sussman. I so appreciated the distinction between the sexual violation of enslaved women and what happens to Clarissa, but would like to hear more about why Clarissa's violation by aristocratic white Lovelace is necessary to the construction of settler colonialism. Thanks.
Okay, so you know, because in an increasingly imperial world, and we can read our horns, just get a presse of that. Men of empire are about to go all over the world and be tempted by these black and brown beauties. But also, as Clarissa shows us, as Pamela shows us, white women are very, very tempting for men too. So I'm arguing that empire at this point requires a consolidation of white womanhood as pure in opposition to the black and brown, overly sexualized, available woman of empire. And that while she is indeed a victim, as are men themselves, of white male patriarchy, she is also, her victimhood comes into play as a tool of white supremacy. And we can see that playing out all the time. I mean, if you look at the archives in Jamaica, for instance, the punishment for an enslaved man for looking lasciviously or for attempting to rape a white woman was incredibly harsh. I won't detail it here. They had, you know, there was literally nothing on the statutes for white men raping black women. That just didn't exist legally. But there were very detailed, gruesome punishments for any black men attempting sexual violence against white women. So that answers the question somewhat. It's hard I know these things are hard to talk about.
Question from Rebecca Barr. I have hazy memories of a plan for Clarissa to move to the Americas after her violation. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is it important that the paragon of pure white womanhood refuses to traffic with the colonies? I'm also thinking, perhaps perversely, about Anna Howe's curation of Clarissa's whiteness. Does the novel build in a model for white feminism that has proven incredibly influential?
That's so interesting, and I didn't even have a hazy memory of that moment. So thank you. Let's go back and look at that moment where no, I'm remembering it now. Actually, and maybe Laura Doyle discusses this too. But if we think of the Americas in British fiction of that time, like Roxana and Maud Flanders, and what going off to the colonies means more generally, I think it helps us with our answer. And yes, okay, I'll just go for it. I'll say that what Richardson's offering us is an alternative to our rapacious male imperialism that would put safely Clarissa and Anna in together. Clarissa with her landed inherited wealth of old England, and that would be a sort of moral core. But again, the emphasis is on purity, on untouchedness, and on Puritanism. So I think even what's radical about Richardson ultimately, I'm arguing, comes back into service of empire.
Thank you. Question from James Wood. Kerry's powerful talk made me think about the relationship between Clarissa's presentation, just jumped for me, Clarissa's presentation as someone who is in a state of living death, and Orlando Patterson's argument that slavery is a state of social death. Are these also very different kinds of living death that are nevertheless structurally related?
Okay, so my answer to that is, and thank you for noting that, is that they are structurally related as appropriation, not as shared. I think that's the distinction I have. Laura Doyle's book's really wonderful, but I think the way in which these are shared experiences, we need to be really careful, especially when we see so many race fakers, especially here in the United States, where sharing cultures that don't belong to you becomes a powerful way for white people to gather some of the credentials of their Black and brown colleagues, certainly in the academy. So in other words, the extended lingering living death that Clarissa gets narrated for her, we don't get that. I mean, one of the bits I had to cut were from John Newton's Middle Passage diaries, in which he's just routinely throwing people overboard after they die of the flux. And there's one particularly tragic moment where he says a woman number 43 died. She has not been properly alive since she got here, and off she goes. So the kinds of living deaths are not comparable, but they are structurally compared, and that's what we have to worry about.
A question from Susan Jones. How do we then treat the actual physiological experience of rape? Can we find a place that unites our responses to that experience across race and gender?
So I think my answer to that is to focus more on the systemic and structural rather than on the inner, because that's just so hard to answer, and because that category of woman and what our psychology or what our experience might be is so widely different. So I think what we can all agree on is the enemy of white male patriarchal settler colonial supremacy. That's what Angela Davis and Bell Hooks insist on us saying all the words in a row when we say it. So I think when we get into these kinds of issues, I think it's always helpful to help us think of what structurally happens, and in that shared experience, it's nevertheless the case that white women remain in service of that bigger project of patriarchy that's harmful to all. And that's why the Combahee Collective argue that once Black queer women are free, we're all free. So I think what we all need to do is to step down off our pedestals, our racialized pedestals, and start fighting for the most disenfranchised structurally. And once we do that, then we will all be in a much better position.
Question from Alex Buckley. This was a wonderfully illuminating talk, thorough and insightful in its explication of Clarissa's discursive context. I'm wondering if you've looked much into Clarissa's reception history, and if so, what you found with regard to Richardson's contemporaries or near contemporaries making connections between Clarissa's white womanhood and the imperial project.
No, the answer. This is very new work, but absolutely that work has to be done. And thank you, for noticing that. Yeah, were other work. I would ask the Richardsonians out there to start thinking again or to looking again. Were her contemporaries? Was the novel read in any way as part of this imperial project, or was it rigidly read as a domestic novel? So thanks for that question. I haven't done that work.
Great, and a last point from Helen Duss, which takes Rebecca Barr's point further. Richardson wrote in a letter that if Lovelace had repented and thus hadn't needed to die, he would have sent him off to be a colonial governor. So I can see Rebecca picking up and another nice example of collaborative research and the value of meetings like this.
Yeah,
Kerry,
absolutely.
you've been terribly hard. Thank you very, very much. What a wonderful question and answer session. Thank you, everybody, for your fabulous questions. Kerry, thank you so much. I wonder, everybody who is here, maybe we could take to the chat again just to give a final round of applause, vote of thanks to our wonderful speaker, to Laura for introducing Kerry so wonderfully, to Elaine for the tech support. Thank you, and to all of you, thank you very much indeed for your contributions, for your questions, for your support in a really wonderful event.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for bearing with me. Have a happy what day is this? Monday. Have a good week. I lost my weekend, so I've literally.
Yeah, I was going to say you haven't had a weekend. I'm so sorry. On behalf of us all, thank you for giving up your weekend. Okay. We ODSECS will gather again on Wednesday, the 23rd of June, at the same time as this session, whatever time that was for you. And James Wood is going to be talking to us about Anne Finch, using the title Anne Finch's Perplexing Form. There are details on the ODSECS website, so do go and find those and sign up and join us. Thank you all very, very much for coming. Maybe Kerry, if you just want to hang around, it would be really nice to just have a quick chat with you after the session. But everybody else, many, many thanks. To leave the session, all you need to do is to close the browser window. Thank you very much.